In the beginning, there was only water. Not land, not sky, just the mingling currents of two ancient beings. Apsu, the fresh waters of order, and Tiamat, the salty depths of chaos. From their union, the first gods were born, but these gods were both loud and restless. Annoyed by their noise, Apsu plotted to silence them forever, but before he could act, he was slain by one of his own descendants, Ea. Enraged, Tiamat rose up in vengeance, birthing an army of monsters with which to wage war on these rowdy young gods. At first, no one dared face Tiamat and her legions in battle, but then, along came Marduk, the young storm god, who split her body in two. One half would go on to form the heavens, the other, the earth. From her carcass came the world, from her consort's blood, humanity. Born not from love, but from battle and sacrifice, the cosmos was carved from chaos and then crowned with divine authority. This is just one of many creation myths, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian story of how our world first began. But have you ever stopped to wonder how those stories themselves began? In our previous episode, we talked about the psychological origins of religion, and how our tendency to over-personify and attribute meaning may have led to our earliest belief in supernatural beings. But then how did these spirits then evolve into gods? What is it that made that transformation occur? How did we go from sensing forces in the wind to worshipping gods with names, stories, and temples in their honor? Today, we'll be exploring the cultural origins of religion, how the shift to settled life may have planted the seeds of organized belief, how the process of syncretism first merged tribal traditions into shared theologies, and how through memetic evolution, these ideas then began to spread, adapt, and endure. This is the story not of the mythic origins of the world, but of the very real origins of myth. Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Thibaut, and I make videos on philosophy and science. So in our previous episode, we talked briefly about animism, the earliest belief system of our distant ancestors, and how this form of religion was something that emerged quite naturally from our human psychology. Today, I want to take this idea out a little further. If our tendency to over-personify and attribute meaning is what led to our perception of the world as inhabited by spirits, then what is it that led to us perceiving these spirits as gods? How did we go from sensing forces in the wind to worshipping deities with names, stories, and temples in their honor? Today, when we think of gods, we tend to view them as timeless and unchanging, as fixed figures of worship with names, powers, and domains. But for most of human history, belief may have been far more ephemeral, more experiential than institutional. The animistic spirits of our earliest ancestors may not have always been given names, nor even clearly personified. A gust of wind through the trees, a rustling in the grass. To a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, these might have felt like presences, but not necessarily beings. They were sensed, not summoned. Experienced, not enshrined. You see, for much of human history, people were on the move, following herds, seasons, and shifting landscapes. In such a world, the spirits that they encountered might have felt just as fluid as their lives, momentary, contextual, and changing with the land. These were not gods etched in stone, but whispers in the wind, felt in a moment and then gone in the next. That began to change as the world itself began to settle. With the warming of the climate and the rise of early agriculture, people began putting down roots, and as people started to stay in one place, perhaps their spirits did too. A river that once flowed past a nomadic camp became the river, the one source of life, season after season. Its presence became predictable, its patterns familiar, and in that familiarity, a story is born, a ritual, a memory passed down. What was once a fleeting impression becomes a figure of tradition, stable, shared, and woven into the fabric of daily life. This is the dawn of something new. From spiritual experience to a religious system, from momentary awe to lasting mythology, from the breath of the wind to the bricks of a temple. So then how exactly did that transformation occur? To answer that, we'll first need to follow the shift from fleeting footprints to lasting symbols. One of the most significant changes that came with the advent of agriculture was the ability to preserve and transmit more than just food and shelter, but also tools, objects, and ideas. While a nomadic hunter-gatherer might carry around only the essential items needed for their survival, an early farmer or pastoralist might have less incentive to discard some of those more unnecessary or impractical items. They could more easily accumulate objects that had more symbolic or sentimental value, such as figurines, carvings, and early ritual objects. In other words, a sedentary lifestyle didn't just make it easier to store grain, it made it easier to store meaning. This is where totemism emerges, the belief in a symbolic connection between a people and a particular object, animal, or feature of the landscape. These weren't just spiritual figures, they were cultural anchors. And when you think about it, totems can be a means of externalizing conceptual symbols into physical form. For example, you might hold in your head a highly abstract notion of what fertility is. But then you could also bring this internalized concept out into the world by carving a figurine. The object then becomes a placeholder for that particular idea, concept, or thought. A totem could be remembered, drawn, carved, and then passed down. It offered symbolic continuity, connecting individuals not just to a spirit world, but to a shared identity, history, and a sense of place. Unlike a passing breeze or a fleeting sensation, these objects endured. They could be touched, returned to, and reinterpreted by each generation. And in their endurance, they allowed the invisible to become visible, anchoring spiritual meaning in a tangible form. Totems allowed people to adhere around shared symbols. This marks an important step from animism to structured belief systems. It's not just that spirits are out there, but that some spirits are ours. And alongside animism, another powerful idea also began to take hold, that of ancestor worship. The belief that our dead didn't simply vanish, but continued to live among us, guiding us, watching us, and sometimes even judging us. As oral traditions passed down stories of lineage, and as burial practices became more and more ritualized, the memory of the dead may have begun to crystallize into reverence. Ancestors weren't just remembered, they were invoked. They became moral and spiritual authorities, bridges between the living and the divine. Stories of brave hunters, wise elders, and cunning tricksters may have been shared around campfires, told and then retold across generations. Over time, these tales would evolve, shaped by memory, embellished through performance, and adapted to new contexts. This is pretty much the essence of the word myth, a story transmitted by word of mouth. In fact, the word myth actually derives from the Greek mythos, originally meaning speech or story, not necessarily something false, but a traditional tale with meaning. These narratives weren't written down but carried orally, woven into the fabric of communal life. And as these stories were passed on, what they may have lost in historicity, they often made up for in symbolic and cultural significance. An ancestor's story, told and then retold across generations, might gradually drift away from memory into symbolic imagery instead. With each retelling, details may have faded or transformed, until the figure at the heart of the tale no longer represented a person, but a lesson, the embodiment or epitome of a particular virtue, flaw, sentiment, or thought. What's important isn't necessarily the factual accuracy of such a story, but rather the meaning that it conveys. For example, we might find value in Greek mythology, not because these myths are true, but because of the truths that they point to. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were tools for teaching, remembering, and uniting. They distilled complex ideas into memorable forms, embedding values, warnings, and ideals into the minds of each new generation. In fact, many of these stories, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Iliad and the Quran, were crafted with rhythm, repetition, and musicality in mind, not just for their beauty, but to aid with their memory in oral traditions. These techniques weren't just aesthetic, they made stories resilient. In the absence of writing, rhythm and repetition ensured that core beliefs could be remembered with surprising fidelity, even as they evolved. Ancient myths weren't just stories, they were performances. Crafted in rhythmic, often musical language, they were easier to remember, recite, and pass down across generations. Now, in case the connection here wasn't clear enough, I just wanted to point this out. It is the exact same thing that is happening with myths as it is with totems. Just as a physical object can become an externalized vessel of meaning that endures over time, so too can a myth transmit symbolic imagery within a given culture. Both totemism and ancestor worship reflect an important shift in religious thinking, from a world where spirits were sensed in the moment, to a world where meaning could be symbolized, stabilized, and transmitted across generations. From fleeting encounters with the sacred, to lasting cultures built around shared memory and meaning. But memory alone doesn't create religion. Cultures are not static, and as they grew and began to meet, their ideas collided, merged, and evolved. This dynamic interaction is what led to the next stage of religious development: syncretism, the blending of myths across cultural boundaries. Our earliest ancestors likely lived in tight-knit communities, essentially as extended family units. Their myths, therefore, would have mostly remained confined to within the family unit itself. As people began forming longer-lasting settlements, however, these communities would have begun encountering different cultures and beliefs. Most importantly, they would have exchanged oral traditions. As communities expanded beyond family lines, forming villages, tribes, and eventually cities, their myths began to travel too. And as different groups came into contact through trade, migration, and conquest, their beliefs didn't just collide, they began to merge. This is a process known as syncretism, the blending of different religious and cultural traditions into a new hybrid system of belief. Gods were equated with other gods, myths were reinterpreted through new lenses, sacred objects took on shared significance. A striking historical example of this can be seen in the early Roman Empire, when Christianity began spreading through a mostly pagan population. Rather than completely replacing the old traditions, many Christian practices absorbed elements of Roman religious life. Pagan winter solstice festivals were reinterpreted as Christmas, spring fertility rituals echoed in Easter. Even saints were sometimes modelled after local deities or heroes. This blending made the new religion more familiar, allowing symbolic continuity even in the midst of spiritual transformation. As myths blended, so too did the characters and forces within them, merging not only names but also deeper symbolic meanings too. This allowed people to recognise reflections of their own gods in the beliefs of others. Say, for instance, that my community reveres a thunderous sky deity, a powerful paternal figure who has command over both lightning and rain. Then, we meet your people, who worship a similar figure, a ruler of the sky, wielding thunder and enforcing cosmic order. Over time, rather than seeing these two deities as wholly distinct, we might come to view them as different manifestations of the same divine force, localized expressions of a universal archetype. And this kind of convergence isn't hypothetical either. Across ancient civilizations, we see remarkably similar sky and thunder gods emerge time and time again. From El, the high god of the Canaanites, to the Greek pantheon and Zeus, and Thor in the Norse sagas. In fact, these fatherly rulers of the heavens share enough attributes that scholars now refer to this archetypal figure as a recurring trope, the Sky Father. What we're seeing here isn't just the merging of deities, it's the repetition of deep narrative patterns. You see, when stories from different cultures are compared, we often find in them recurring motifs, familiar characters, plot structures, and symbolic roles. These are sometimes called tropes, or in a deeper sense, archetypes. Universal story elements that echo across time and tradition. Think of the young hero guided by a wiser elder, or the prince setting out to save the princess. These aren't just cliches, they're narrative tools that help make stories more intelligible. They're symbolic shortcuts that help us get to the essence of a myth more easily. A relatively more modern parallel of this can be found in the works of the brothers Grimm back in the 1800s. For centuries, various fairy tales had been passed down orally throughout Europe, told and retold across different regions, each with its own local flavour. The Grimm brothers collected, compared, and compiled these variations, identifying recurring motifs and narrative structures. What emerged was a synthesized body of folklore, a cohesive collection of stories that distilled a patchwork of oral traditions into the fairy tales that we know and love today. What the Grimm brothers did was, in a way, a modern echo of a much older process, the crystallization of oral tradition into cultural canon. But then how did that crystallization occur? How did we decide on which stories to remember and which ones to forget? In a world of merging myths, it is only the most adaptable that endured, evolving, spreading, and outcompeting the rest. In the great ecosystem of ideas, only the fittest myths survived. Those that were flexible enough to adapt, compelling enough to spread, and meaningful enough to endure. With the advent of agriculture, our ancestors stopped wandering and began to settle. Their belief systems too began to take root, as people began planting not only crops, but also the foundations of long-lasting communities. Perhaps it's no coincidence, therefore, that the term that we use for both the act of cultivation itself and the development of shared customs is one and the same: culture. Because as people began living in larger, more stable groups, ideas themselves gained new soil to grow in. Another important development, of course, that came along with agriculture was the emergence of early writing systems. These began not as alphabets, but as ideographic and pictographic scripts. Visual symbols designed to represent objects, ideas, and sounds. While some of the earliest marks were used for accounting grain and livestock, others took on a more symbolic role, recording myths, rituals, and divine genealogies. Stories, symbols, and rituals no longer had to be passed down in these fragile oral chains. They could now be recorded, repeated, and refined. And with these larger, more stable communities came a new kind of evolutionary force. Not biological, but cultural. This is where we truly begin to see the rise of memes as we understand them today. Not just funny internet pictures, but units of meaning that spread, adapt, and survive through minds. If you're at all familiar with internet culture, then you probably already know that memes come in all shapes and forms. Some are dank, some are mid. Some are creative, while others can be maddeningly repetitive. Either way, what's important to note is that memes always exist within a given ecology. All memes compete for the same resource, namely for our attention on social media. And just like genes in a biological organism, certain memes, ideas, beliefs, and behavioral patterns proved more adaptive than others. Some myths, like contagious sparks, leapt from mind to mind, spreading not through force, but through fascination. A story worth listening to was a story worth telling, and those that resonated deeply, spread easily, or that served a social function often tended to survive. Others faded away. In a way, it was survival of the catchiest. Even before the emergence of human myths, we can already see the roots of culture in other species too. In one primate group, a high-ranking female began adorning herself with a feather on her head. Within days, other females in the group began to imitate her, not for survival, but perhaps just for status, style, or simple mimicry. In the oceans, humpback whales have been observed singing songs that evolve over time, with new melodic variations spreading across entire populations year by year. When one group encounters another, they exchange songs, adding some of the catchier melodies to their own unique rosters. These aren't just behaviours, they're traditions, passed down, copied, and shared. They show that the basic ingredients of culture, prestige, imitation, and transmission, predate us. In this light, memes aren't just a human affair. It's part of a deeper biological story about how ideas and behaviours replicate in minds, across generations, and even across species. This is the beginning of memetic evolution, the idea that culture, like biology, evolves through variation, selection, and inheritance. But instead of flesh and blood, this evolution plays out in our minds. Viewed like this, mythology isn't just storytelling, it's cultural DNA. Myths and memes evolve just like organisms, adapting to their environments and passing on their symbolic genes. In this sense, religions themselves function as memeplexes, not just single ideas, but bundled sets of beliefs, symbols, and practices that cohere together, reinforce each other, and replicate as a unit. And just as genes are subject to natural selection, these cultural bundles too face their own kinds of evolutionary pressures. For example, many branches of Christianity have, in recent decades, revised their stances on issues like LGBTQ inclusion, not because the core theology changed, but because adapting to shifting social norms became essential for survival in a modern moral landscape. But survival alone isn't enough. Religions aren't parasites, they're symbiotes. We don't thrive despite them, but through them. They endure because they help us make life more intelligible. They offer us meaning. These tropes became excellent vessels of meaning, helping us convey highly abstract concepts into symbolic and memorable forms. In the Babylonian creation myth, for example, after Tiamat is slain, water flows from her eyes, forming the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The story itself, the Enuma Elish, would be ritually recited each spring during the Akitu festival which timed perfectly with the yearly flooding of these rivers. The fact that both the myth and festival were tied to the seasonal flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers made it easier for farmers to remember when to plant their crops, and also reinforced deeper themes such as cosmic renewal, fertility, or the triumph of order over chaos. This myth offered predictability over what would have otherwise been a chaotic system. Similarly, for centuries, farmers in India would plant their crops according to a religious calendar, one that was rooted not only in myth, but in long-standing observation of the natural world. After independence from colonial rule, however, India began shifting toward a modern national calendar based on the sidereal year, and many farmers now started relying on this Gregorian calendar instead to time their planting. The result? Catastrophic crop failures. The rains still came as they always had, but their timing no longer aligned with the new dates. What had seemed like superstition turned out to be finely tuned cultural wisdom, encoded not in textbooks, but in ritual and myth. Religion, therefore, is more than just the belief in gods. It is the memory of a people, preserved in ritual and ceremony. Whether those gods are true or not is irrelevant. What matters are the truths that they help us see. The gods don't exist because we were told to believe in them. They exist because through them, we can begin to make sense of the world. The stories that endured weren't random. The gods that we remembered weren't remembered by accident. The ones that survived did so because they resonated, psychologically, emotionally, and socially. They spoke to our fears and hopes, offering frameworks for action. They adapted to new contexts while preserving old truths. And so the comparison between biology and culture, between the evolution of bodies and the evolution of beliefs, isn't just clever, it's revealing. Because as myths took root in settled communities, they didn't just shape what people believed, they began to shape what people built, how they dressed, how they sang, and even how they saw the world. Religions in particular became powerful engines of symbolic expression. From Gothic cathedrals that reached like stone prayers towards the heavens, to intricate mandalas charting the inner cosmos, and the fluid geometry of Islamic calligraphy, the sacred didn't just live in texts and doctrines, it manifested itself through architecture, art, music, and ritual. Faith became something not only thought or spoken, but carved into mountains, painted onto ceilings, and echoed in chants that outlived their singers. And just as a virus in the body can cause visible symptoms on the skin, an idea, once it grips and infects a given population, can erupt into the landscape itself. Temples rise, monuments are built, cities become punctuated by spires and shrines, as if the terrain itself were testifying to the myth that animates it. In this way, religions became not just belief systems, but symbolic ecosystems, living structures of shared meaning, continuously adapting, spreading, and leaving real-world traces wherever they went. Religion, then, is not just a remnant of ancient superstition. It's a living archive of our cultural evolution. From the fireside tales of our nomadic ancestors to the cathedrals of empires, religion emerged not from a single revelation, but from countless acts of remembrance, reinvention, and resonance. But what made religion truly powerful wasn't just the stories that it told, but what those stories made us do. Beyond stories alone, it's in action that religion's true power emerges. This will be the subject of our next video, the social origins of religion. So if you're interested in this kind of content, stick around for that. In the end, what we call religion is really a vast, evolving ecosystem of stories, symbols, and practices. A cultural organism that grows wherever humans seek meaning, beauty, and belonging. And in a world of scattered minds, it gave us something powerful, a way to move, believe, and remember, together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and go check out part 1 if you haven't done already. Until next time, I've been your host Thibaut, and I will see you in the next one. Stay curious.